All right, well, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our annual spirituality series, sponsored by our Temple's Adult Education Committee. It's so great to be with you all. In these next 3 February evenings together, we're going to have the opportunity to explore our faith individually and as a spiritual community. How often do we get to do that? I mean, we celebrate Shabbat, we celebrate holidays, we do book clubs, we do all types of things. But how often do we get to really explore our faith with each other and talk about it and feel like it's a safe space to do so? And that's what we're creating together, is a space, a sacred space for us to explore individually and together as a community. And we're also in these 3 sessions together, we're going to discover a variety of different Jewish approaches to the divine. We're going to study and look at least 9 different Jewish approaches to God, maybe 1 or 2 more than that. We'll also have an opportunity to reflect on our personal relationship with God. However, as much as you'd like to be comfortable sharing that, but we're together, whether we're speaking or listening and taking it in, we're going to each reflect on our personal relationship with God in the next 3 weeks. And we're going to look at how we experience the divine in our lives and in the world. And hopefully what we're going to do together for these next 3 classes is we're going to deepen our spirituality. Now, some people don't like that word. I love that word. To me, spirituality is like God and it's like love. It's in the eye of the beholder. It's a nice big word that encompasses a lot of different ideas. And here's how when I speak of spirituality, this is what I have in mind. We're going to deepen our connection with aspects of life that are larger than ourselves. We're going to deepen our connection with aspects of life that are larger than ourselves, aspects that help give our lives meaning and purpose. So to me, spirituality is about 2 things, about connection, it's about meaning, and we're also going to deepen, hopefully, aspects that provide us with a deeper level of engagement with life itself in this one wild, wonderful life that we have to live. What was Mary Oliver's phrase? This wild something life. If you know it, please put it in the chat box. We read that, I think we read that during the High Holy Days. It's in our Machzor. It's in our High Holy Day prayer book. This one wild something life. I'm blanking on the second adjective. But we're going to do that. So Mary Oliver would be proud, I think. So that's what we're going to do in the next 3 February evenings together. And we're going to do that through experiential activities and discussion, learning about Jewish approaches to the divine. So I'll share some things and some quotes and some teachings about that you may or may not be familiar with. And we're going to do all of this with an honest, hopefully an honest and heartfelt reflection. Now, I want to encourage you all to be open and curious about your very own experiences with the divine, with God, whatever name that you want to use, to be open and curious with your own experiences and to have an open and curious approach to everything that we're going to be discussing and sharing. I think we're going to learn. The more open we are, the more curious we are, I think we're going to learn more, and we may add, I hope we add, to what we currently might think about God. And very importantly, I think this is the most important sort of ground rule for us to, discuss together in the next 3 weeks. Please know there is no one right way to think about God in Judaism. There is no one right way to conceive of God, think about God, to relate to God in Judaism. Now, there are, I think, at least 1 or 2 wrong ways to do it, which maybe we'll discuss later. But for now, please know there are many legitimate, acceptable, diverse Jewish approaches to God. And this spirituality series is about exploring and experiencing approaches that work best for you, that are authentic for you, that you can believe, that you can affirm in your life freely without coercion or feeling like you have to, or you're supposed to, or your parents would want you to, or somebody else would want you to. It's about you believing and affirming it, and it comes from you. And by the way, if you don't believe in any of the approaches that we explore, that's okay too. I do think authenticity can be one of our most valuable guides in this endeavor, because this is a very subjective spiritual enterprise we are undertaking together. Exploring our faith is very subjective. Deepening our spirituality is very personal, and our relationship with the divine is very subjective and personal. I hope it's very personal for you. So it's deeply personal, and there is no one right way to do it, and there never has been. There never has been just one way to do Judaism ever. So just to give you one example from our liturgy, from our Jewish prayers, you might know this very well. Consider the heart of Jewish worship. Consider the Amidah, that standing prayer when we're in sanctuary, standing together, and it's safe to do so. When we pray after Adonai, like that, and then we go into the Hebrew, and what we say in English, right there in the Avot Va'imahot, the blessing related to our ancestors in the Amidah, quote, we are addressing the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, and the God of Sarah, the God of Rebekah, the God of Rachel, and the God of Leah. 7 times in our liturgy, we repeat that Hebrew word Elohei, the word for God, 7 times in one sentence. Why does our prayer book repeat God so many times? Wouldn't it make more sense to recite the word God once and then list the 7 matriarchs and patriarchs? God of Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Just say God once. That's more economical. That's more grammatically correct. It's less redundant. It makes more sense. Why don't we do it that way? Does anybody know? If you know, please put in the chat box, or feel free to unmute yourself. Carol, feel free to unmute yourself.
My understanding is it's because God is individual to each person, and each person's relationship with God is individual. So it is God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob.
Yeah, Carol, yes, exactly. Our Jewish sages teach us that each one of our matriarchs and patriarchs experienced God differently. They had a unique personal relationship with God, as Carol said, and we honor that diversity and plurality of their experiences, recognizing that they were not the same. So too with us. Each one of us is going to experience God differently. Each one of us is going to think about God differently. And by the way, we might think about God differently, experience God differently, different times during the day. I like to say, my conception of God is dependent on how much sleep I got, what's my blood sugar level, have I eaten, and what's going on in my life. That is going to affect how I relate to God, how I conceive of God, how I perceive of God in my life, or maybe absent from my life. It changes all the time. And again, it always has. And we're going to look at some Jewish texts, and we're going to see that is the case. So we're going to begin together, and thank you, Shelley. Mary Oliver's quote, "Tell me, what is your plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" I love it. What a good word too, precious. What are we going to do with our one wild and precious life? How are we going to relate to God in this one wild and precious life? And how are we going to relate to something larger than ourselves in this one wild and precious life? So let's begin this exploration together. Now, did everybody get, Carol, did you get, Howie, did you get, by the way, it's the first time I've called you Howie. Is that okay? It's always been Howard, and everybody I know calls you Howie, and it just felt right. So did you guys get the PDFs in the link? You got it. Perfect. Did anybody not get the PDFs that were in the email that went out yesterday that had the link to, you know, this, and the PDFs were included? Did anybody not get one of those? If you can raise your hand.
I did not get it.
All right. Was that Marilyn?
Yes.
All right. Hi, Marilyn. If I put something in the chat box for you now, I'll put it in for everybody. Marilyn, let me know if you're able to open up. Are you able to open up files in the chat box?
I don't know.
All right, let's try it. So I'm going to do this for everybody just in case you want another version of it.
I don't see anything in there.
Oh, that's because I'm slow, and I was in a B'nai Mitzvah folder, and I got to switch to Dropbox. I got to go into here. Let's see. Here
Marilyn,
we go.
did you get the email yesterday morning?
I didn't get a chance to look at my email. We were online for an hour waiting to get our shot.
Okay.
That hour was before they got to us with the needle. I didn't look at my email.
Okay, because
glad you both got your shot. You and Ben got your vaccine?
The first shot, yes. I'm thrilled.
Well, that's a wonderful moment. By the way, Shehechianu moment, right? When
Pardon?
we think about the Shehechianu prayer, we're thanking God for keeping us alive, sustaining us, and allowing us to reach that moment. That is a Shehechianu moment. I'm going to say the Shehechianu when I get my vaccine. So that's a good Jewish prayer if you're looking for something Jewish to do after that moment.
Rabbi, do I just download this? It says it's a PDF. I don't know. I would have.
Try this, Marilyn. Just click on it. See what happens.
I did click on it, but I don't know where to put it that I could read it.
Oh, okay. Well, let's do this, Marilyn. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share my screen for tonight, but I just want to make sure you have it after tonight. Okay. So
okay.
it's
I'll go into my emails and find it. Okay,
wonderful, wonderful. So what we're going to look at, for those of you who do have it, it's that page that says, and I'm going to share the screen in just a second. It's the page that says, it has a 1 and a 2 questions, and we're going to look at the first question. Now, before we look at the first question, I want to give some gratitude to a very special Jewish theologian who passed away a few years ago. Carol, you might know who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Professor Neil Gilman of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Professor Neil Gilman, friends, was a great Jewish theologian who was a professor of Jewish philosophy. That was his title. He was the chair of Jewish philosophy at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. That is the conservative seminary in New York that's been around for, I think, 100 years or so, maybe a little bit more. And Professor Gilman taught there, and he also, lectured widely to adults throughout the country at conferences and biennials. And he went into classrooms with kids, and he spoke about God and got them to speak about God in the classroom. And he wrote a number of books that you can find on Amazon. Just go onto Amazon or at your local library, type in the name Neil Gilman. I am going to put his name in the chat box for everybody so you know how to spell it. That's Neil Gilman. This activity, this first question comes from him. And I am indebted to him for this question. And more than that, I am indebted to Professor Gilman of blessed memory for the way that I was fortunate to hear him lecture and talk about God in ways that helped other people think about God and talk about God and discuss God. He really was quite brilliant in the way that he presented Jewish theology. And I recommend any of his books to you. And this first exercise comes from him. So let me share the screen, and you have it too. So I'm sharing this for Marilyn and Ben and for anybody else who would like to look at it on the screen. Now, can you all see that okay? Can you see my screen okay? So this is what I want you all to think about. And maybe some of you have thought about this already when you printed it out from yesterday. The question is quite simple. When you think about God, what comes to your mind? When you think about God, what comes to your mind? What images, what words, what qualities, what questions do you think about? What comes to your mind? What feelings come to your heart when you think about God? What sensory experiences come to your mind when you think about God? That's a lot of what do you think about. So I'm just giving you ways to answer the question, but ultimately it all comes down to when you think about God, what comes to your mind? So I just want to spend a minute for us to think about it. And I'm going to be quiet for a minute. And I'd like to ask people after I'm quiet to maybe share an image or an idea or a quality or a question or a feeling. So let's just spend a minute quietly reflecting. When we think about God, what comes to your mind? I didn't set a stopwatch. It feels like a minute. Who would like to share? Who would like to share? And I'm going to stop the screen share so I can see you all and I can see the chat box or see the hands that go up. Who would somebody like to share when they think about God, what comes to their mind? Yes, thank you, Heather.
Ben.
Oh, okay.
Ben wants to say something.
So Ben, please. Ben and then Heather.
The things I think about is why God has decided to leave me on earth and not take me at a younger age. I'm approaching 93 and he still leaves me here and he didn't take me to heaven. So apparently he wants to leave me on earth to do good work, or he just doesn't want to see me.
I think it was the last one. He doesn't want to see that.
That's a great question. That's a great question. Why, you said it perfectly. I'm not even going to rephrase it because the way you said it was wonderful. Absolutely. That's a great question to think and reflect upon. And you gave some answers, and maybe, you'll continue to think of some possible.
I've got to take care of Marilyn.
That's another great answer. Again, and by the way, what this goes back to, remember when I said about spirituality is about connection and it's about meaning and purpose. Ben, you've asked a question, and then you've answered the question with two different purposeful actions for you to take. One is to do good things for other people, and another is to help take care and be a physical presence for your beloved wife. Those are two great answers that provide meaning and purpose that are extremely powerful. So thank you for sharing that. Heather, what comes to mind when you think about God? Oh, Heather, you're muted.
When I think of God, I think of an enormous entity that encompasses all. but also is very internal and personal. So I am a reflection of God, and the universe is a reflection. So when I pray to God, I I pray to a large entity. It's just not, it's not touchable, it's not seeable, it just is a sort of amorphous.
I like that, Heather. Thank you for sharing that. And by the way, I imagine how many people, and again, I want to stimulate conversation and discussion, and also to let people know, which often happens, that sometimes because this is so personal, we don't get a chance to talk about our faith and our beliefs. We might think we're the only person who thinks and feels that way. And it's neat to discover that other people think and feel that way. And I think it's especially neat and to discover that great Jewish theologians wrote about that, taught about that, and we might not even be aware they ever existed, but they are there. So, do other people, with what Heather had said, do they sometimes perceive and conceive of God that way, as a sort of an all-encompassing entity that maybe has, not picturing a physical form, but just a concept of all-encompassing, a being that is very personal? A number of people, see the hands, Heather? A number of people think that way as well, perceive God that way as well. And like I say, I think it's neat to see when other people say, I think that way too. I thought it was just me. So thank you for sharing that. I know some people are putting stuff in the chat box, so let me read some of that. Thinking of embracing, comforting when they think of God, a sense of embrace, a sense of comfort, a sense of peace. And then there's and then, by the way, and again, I want to honor the not believing certain things. I really want to honor that, so one response is there is no God. And in Judaism, I want you to know there are some great Jewish thinkers and great Jewish philosophers and great Jewish folks who have had a tremendously positive impact on the world. And if you were to ask them, do you think there is a God? They would say, nope, I do not. And that is okay in Judaism. That is okay. You're in good company if you think that way. Now, here's one approach that I want to take. And in this time together, I want us to think about, for those of us who don't have a God concept, or say that there is no God, I want to ask rhetorically, and feel free to answer at some point during our time together, what is it about God that you don't believe? What is it about God that you don't believe? And the reason that I ask that question as a follow-up is because you might find there's a great Jewish theologian, or many great Jewish theologians, who would agree with you 100%. They don't believe that either. So they have either created or studied or learned, or however you want to say it, they have come to a God concept that our ancestors might say, oh, you're an atheist. You don't believe in God. But that theologian would say, no, I do believe in God. I just believe differently about God than you do. But my concept is as legitimate and as kosher as yours is. And so that's where like I say, and if at the end of our 3 days, or our three weeks together, you say everything that we've talked about, I still don't buy any of it. That's fine too. But again, I want us to challenge ourselves and step outside where we are right now if we can. And I want to give you an image for that. It's Jacob wrestling with a being, a mysterious being at night. You know that story from the Torah. Jacob is alone wrestling with this being. Some say an angel. Some say it may be Esau's God or Esau's guardian angel, whatever it is, because he was about to confront his twin brother Esau after many, many years. And that being says to Jacob at the end, let me go, day is breaking. And Jacob says, I will not go until you bless me. And that being says, no longer shall you be named Yaakov, but your name now will be Yisrael, because you have wrestled, striven with gods and with others, and you have prevailed. So we are God wrestlers. We struggle with God. We have doubts about God. I want to suggest that any great Jewish theologian who has a strong belief in God has had doubts about their beliefs. And I hope they've had doubts about their beliefs, because it's the doubting that I think clarifies our beliefs and strengthens our beliefs. So this is not blind faith that Judaism advocates, but a very well thought out, reasoned, authentic wrestling with faith. So again, all of that is just to say, we're going to clarify our terms about what do we mean when we use the word God, and different theologians have meant different things. And again, you might be surprised to think, oh, I didn't know you could conceive of God that way. That works, or not. Let me keep going back. Other people are saying when they think of God, they think of hope. They think of gratitude and responsibility. The feeling of the earth solid beneath me while feeling weightless in the same moment. And the movement and life of breath. Beautiful. This is all beautiful ideas about God. I'm not sure if I feel there is a God. I have lots of doubts. And you're, again, in very good company. I much prefer that people doubt and then go through that doubt and struggle and wrestle and reflect and come out the other side than to not have doubts. What frightens me most about any belief is certitude. You show me somebody who is 100% certain that their way is the right way,
Yeah.
and I will show you a frightening person, perhaps.
Yes.
So I think what Judaism advocates, I go back to Micah, I could build my entire edifice of Judaism on the sentence of the prophet, the Hebrew prophet Micah, when he said, it has been told you what God asks of you to do justly, to love kindness and mercy, and to walk humbly with God. And I focus on that walking humbly, to be humble in our beliefs, to be modest in our beliefs, to ask ourselves, is it possible we're wrong? Are you sure? And to be okay addressing, are you sure? Whatever the answer is. No, I'm not sure, but this is what I believe. Okay. And I'll share something else that was shared. Well, for people who shared something with me directly, well, if you could answer with me privately, for those of you who put in the chat your response to me privately, are you comfortable with me sharing that? And if you will then in the chat box say, yes, I'm comfortable, or please don't. And then I will go on. Let's see, Carolyn, our educator. I think of God as an encompassing energy field that is a force opposing chaos. I can't even pronounce that word, Carolyn. Negentropy? Negentropy that pushes everything toward orderly connection and interdependence. Okay, very nice. Very nice. Thank you, Carolyn. And again, I think other people might share that idea too. And we have somebody else said, I believe God is not a cosmic vending machine that grants stuff to us because we praise him or because we do something. Right, right. Okay, that's another belief. And by the way, if your belief is that is who God is, that's okay too. So again, by sharing these beliefs, nobody's right, nobody's wrong. And I guess I'll tell you now the two caveats for what I think is a wrong way to think about God. I've already told you one, and I'll share it again. To think that there is only one way to conceive of God, I think is a wrong way to think about God, because that's not in our tradition. You open up a Bible, you're going to get dozens of different, this is Neil Gaiman's terms, word pictures, metaphors, and we're going to talk about metaphor tonight. But there are dozens, if not hundreds, of metaphors for God, word pictures for God that are very different from one another. There is no one uniform image, portrait, metaphor for God in the Bible, not just one, there's many. So to me, the only wrong way to think about God in Judaism is to say there's only one way to think about God. And the only other wrong way to think about God in Judaism is to say that one particular human being who lived on this earth 2,000 years ago is God and nobody else is, i.e. Jesus. That is not a Jewish belief. That's a Christian belief, and that's a fine belief if you are Christian. But if you are Jewish and you believe that Jesus is God in the flesh and nobody else is God in the flesh, that's not a Jewish God concept. That's a Christian God concept. So those are my only two caveats: to say that only Jesus is God, and to say that there's only one path, there's only one conception of God that's kosher in Judaism. Everything else is on the table, and that includes not believing in God. Everything else is on the table. Now, one question is this, would Orthodoxy say differently? And it's a great question. Would Orthodox Judaism say there is only one picture of God? I don't think so, because they're looking at the same Bible that I'm looking at. They would say there are many faces to God. There are many approaches to God. What we started with that midrash, that teaching about, God of, all the seven patriarchs repeated because they all had a different approach to God, a different relationship. That's in the Orthodox canon of Jewish teaching as well. Would an Orthodox approach lean toward a more sort of rabbinic approach, conception of God? Maybe more so than a Reform or conservative Jew. And we're going to talk about sort of the rabbinic approach to God, the rabbinic conception of God. But there are Orthodox Jews I know. Ask Yitz Greenberg, Rabbi Irving Greenberg. He's got some really neat ideas about God that maybe other Orthodox Jews would say, Yitz, you're out of your mind. So I think it depends on the Orthodox Jew that you ask. But even within Orthodox Judaism, Maimonides had an approach to God that's very different than the rabbinic approach to God. And Maimonides is accepted in Orthodox Judaism, as is the rabbis of the Talmud. So any Orthodox Jew who would say there's only one approach, I would be happy to debate them, because I think that there's a strong argument that there is no one Orthodox conception of God. Anyway, I've spoken too long about that. Let me continue with your concepts. When I'm feeling alone or down, when I reach out for my faith, I feel uplifted and sustained. Thank you, Carol. Yes, God is a source of comfort and strength and love and connection. Absolutely. Very Jewish idea. Tina, I believe God is everywhere and anywhere, a sense of watching over me. Even with the recent very unexpected loss in my family, Tina, as many of you know, her brother-in-law, Keith, was recently died, shockingly, suddenly. And that was, it was a real shock to all of them, and feel a sense of love, and it allows me to formulate an explanation. So yes, God is often a way to respond to tragedy, a way to respond to loss and suffering. And I think most Jewish theologians would say that a really good Jewish God concept, worth its weight in salt or whatever, you've got to deal with evil and suffering. Remember how former President Clinton said it's about the economy, stupid? Remember, he like that was his mantra. It's about the economy, stupid. He was saying that to himself to always remember that he's got to talk economy. That's what was on people's minds. I would say the same about Jewish theology. It's about evil. It's about suffering. It's that's not only what God is about. But if our God concept, if our way that we understand God cannot answer why is there evil in the world, why is there suffering, then I think it's missing something. So I think all really good Jewish theologies and God concepts address evil, suffering, loss. I think religion very much has been created to deal with our own mortality. We are perhaps one of the few living beings on this earth that is aware that one day we will die. And how do we deal with that knowledge? How do we deal with that awareness? I believe that religion was created in many ways to deal with the awareness, the consciousness that one day we will die. And how do we deal with that? I'm a firm believer in that. But there's more to it. It's much broader than that. Religion is also the impulse to blessing and wonder and amazement and beauty and seeing a sunset and going, wow, look at that. Seeing the Grand Canyon, seeing a mountain, seeing a beloved person, seeing a child born. Religion is also the response to that. It is a response to the greatest joys and the greatest sorrows of our lives. To me, fundamentally, that is what religion is, and that is what God is about. Relating to a source of that blessing and, in some cases, tragedy. All right. People are saying they're seeing, somebody else's reflections in their own. Yes, you've said, I agree with what you say. God is my answer to where we come from and where we go. Yeah, the source of life and the source of death. All right, great. Thank you all for sharing that. I want you to continue to answer that question that Professor Gilman of blessed memory would begin many a conversation and a teaching about Jewish theology with children and adults. When you think about God, what comes to your mind, and maybe reflect more on it at home and during these next 3 weeks, and seeing if your concepts change, if your ideas change, if your metaphors change. And by the change doesn't mean that what you thought before is wrong or you changed your mind. It just means that maybe there's a whole different way of approaching this, depending on the day and what you're thinking and what your experiences are. Yeah, for nature, as Jill is saying in the chat box, for a lot of people, nature is, and the beauty and the awesomeness and wonder of nature is one of the quickest routes to the divine and God. And that's certainly the case in many of the Psalms, the nature Psalms that speak of God and speak of the beauty and the wonder and the sublime aspect of nature. So now I want to talk about another thing that Professor Gilman spoke about often in his books, in his lectures, and it resonates with me, and I hope it resonates with you. And that is, when we talk about God, we're really talking about word pictures and metaphors. When we speak of God, when we think of God, these are word pictures, these are metaphors, and they are very personal, based on our own experiences. So here's an example of that, and then we're going to look at metaphor and a definition of metaphor that is wonderful, and then we're going to look at that great article by Rabbi Toba Spitzer that I provided for you about God as a metaphor, a guide for the perplexed. What do we say at a funeral? If we don't say this at a funeral, what do we feel is lacking? It's a poem. It's from the Bible. Who would like to put in the chat box what is said at a Jewish and a Christian funeral? 23rd Psalm, Kaddish as well. I was thinking in this case of the 23rd Psalm. God is my shepherd. I shall not want. God makes me lie down in green pastures. God leads me beside the still waters. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. That's like 6 metaphors, at least. We could spend an hour looking at Psalm 23 and count up all the metaphors. Those are all metaphors for God. How about for the High Holy Days? What's one of the biggest metaphors? So we have a shepherd. God is our shepherd. And all of the associations that we have with the shepherd caring for the flock and feeding the flock and protecting the flock and walking the flock, with being with them all the time. What's another major metaphor we have for God during the High Holy Days? We set it to music. We set this metaphor to music. I'll give you a second. Yes, parents.
Avinu Malkeinu.
Avinu Malkeinu, Avinu Malkeinu. Absolutely. Right. God is a parent. Now, we used to translate Avinu, and by the way, a literal translation of Avinu is our Father. But lately we haven't been translating it, right? Our prayer book doesn't translate it. It just has the word Avinu. So we can internally translate it as our Father, our Mother. That works too. Avinu, Imanu, either one. God is a father. God is a mother. God is a king, a melech. God is a queen. Major metaphors for God. God is, how about this? Think about the Unatana Tokef. We pass before God as a rock. Absolutely. God is a rock, and all the associations that we have with the strength, the solidity of a rock. God is a judge, right? Rosh Hashanah, Yom Hadin, the day of judgment. We pass before God, and God judges us for a year of blessing or a year of Saurus. All these metaphors that we have for God. Some of them contradict each other. Some of them complement each other. But they're all there. They're there in the Bible. They're there in the Torah and the other books of the Bible. So let's define a metaphor. So give me a second. This is a beautiful definition of metaphor that Rabbi Toba Spitzer led me to and may lead you to, if we'll look at the end of her article. And she's going to mention a couple of linguists and cognitive scientists and philosophers of note. So let me give you, this is from two professors and philosophers, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, in their book, Metaphors We Live By. Metaphors We Live By. This is the, and Carolyn is saying too in the chat box, Keanu Amecha has 14 metaphors for God. So here is a definition of metaphor. I love this. The essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. Understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. This is not just a poetic device. This is not just figurative a rhetoric that, you know, great poets use and great writers use. We all use metaphors. It is how we understand and experience our lives, that one kind of thing is in terms of another. It corresponds to another. It's represented by another. Let me give you one other of their understandings of metaphor to flesh it out even more. This is again, and I'm going to give you the book and I'm going to give you the authors. Again, this is Professors Lakoff and Johnson in their book, Metaphors We Live By. Metaphor is for most people, and I put in considered as a device. So metaphor is for most people considered a device of the poetic imagination and the rhetorical flourish, a matter of extraordinary rather than ordinary language. Moreover, metaphor is typically viewed as characteristic of language alone, a matter of words rather than thought or action. For this reason, most people think they can get along perfectly well without metaphor. We have found, on the contrary, that metaphor is pervasive in everyday life, not just in language, but in thought and action. And to that, we can add feeling. That we sometimes, well, maybe thought and action. Thought, action, language, everyday life, we think in metaphor. And I'll tell you what I've discovered. I use more metaphors today than I used when I was 20 or when I was 40. Sometimes my kids will say to me, "Why do you talk like that?" Because I'm constantly using metaphors. I'm constantly drawing from this catalog, this list, this concordance of metaphors and analogies and similes that I've acquired over all my years of living. That's how I think now. And I probably always thought like that, but now I'm just verbalizing it more. Sure, time is money. Sure, that's a metaphor we all know. Life is a journey. That's a metaphor we all know. What are some other metaphors that we use in our everyday language that you use, that you turn to as a way to explain things or understand things? Do any come to mind, Louise?
Life is a box of chocolates.
Forrest Gump, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Right. And so there is a metaphor of a box of chocolates to explain how life works, how life functions for most of us. We often never know what we're going to get. Yeah. Shabbat is a stop sign. Thank you, Carolyn. Yay, Shabbat is a stop sign. It's a time for us to pause and reflect. Huh? Go ahead, Carolyn.
I couldn't help it.
No, I love it. And again, that's why I love that statement. Like, who thinks of a stop sign in Shabbat? But these kids at Jewish camp, again, using their metaphoric mind, their metaphoric imagination, that's what they came up with. And we'll go back to that definition. It is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. It's understanding and experiencing Shabbat through an image of a stop sign. Metaphor is everywhere. And if you want to learn more about it, read their book. And let's take a look now at Toba Spitzer and how she shows us some wonderful metaphors for God that are found in the Bible, that are found in Jewish tradition, and that we might draw upon in the way that we relate to God. Classic Jewish sources. All right, I'm going to share it on the screen too, because what I did is I highlighted, if I can find it. I highlighted some passages of that article, that essay by Rabbi Toba Spitzer, who's a Reconstructionist rabbi. We're going to talk about Reconstructionism, and Mordecai Kaplan, major Jewish theologian, perhaps the most major Jewish theologian of the 20th century. Mordecai Kaplan and founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. So hopefully y'all can see my screen. Can y'all see my screen okay?
Yes.
Yeah, so? Okay, so what I did is I highlighted certain sections of Toba Spitzer's article. And let me see if I can do this too. I don't know if I can do this. Let's try this. And forgive me, I can't see my chat box right now. But I think when the chat comes up, if you put something in there, I think it's going to pop up on my screen. So this is entitled God in Metaphor, A Guide for the Perplexed, playing off of Moses Maimonides of the 12th century, the great Jewish philosopher, his book, A Guide for the Perplexed, A Guide to the Perplexed. Somebody's saying they used to be in the Reconstructionist movement. So I'm going to be very revealing. I love Reform Judaism. If I had to choose a branch of Judaism, and I've had Orthodox practices, Orthodox friends, I belonged to a conservative synagogue for a number of years with my grandmother when I was in my early 20s. I thought about going to Jewish Theological Seminary, but as a philosophy, the Reform approach to Judaism is my approach to Judaism. But if I had to choose a second, it would be Reconstructionist Judaism. I think a number of Reform Jews who went to seminary have been highly influenced by Reconstructionist Judaism and may even be practicing Reconstructionists. But we'll talk about that later. But anyway, Rabbi Toba Spitzer, and I am delighted to hear, I went on a webinar with her recently, and that's what led me to finding out more about her and finding this article. And she mentioned, she talked about God as metaphor, like Neil Gilman used to do, and Professor Gilman. And she said she's coming out with a book in the next year about God in metaphor, and I can't wait till it comes out. I'm going to be counting the days till it comes out. But this article, I think, is giving us a taste of what her book's going to be about. So this is what Rabbi Toba Spitzer says. What I've come to understand in recent years is that the God problem that so many people have, the difficulty of believing in or even taking seriously the notion of some kind of all-powerful, all-knowing being that interacts with us in mysterious ways is not really a problem with God. Rather, it's a reaction to a metaphor or a set of metaphors that have come to dominate our thinking about God. And by the way, all-powerful, all-knowing, that's in Judaism, but that doesn't have to be how you approach it. There are plenty of Jewish God concepts that don't have God as being all-powerful and all-knowing. The most famous example, a major influence in my life, Rabbi Harold Kushner, when bad things happen to good people. That's not an all-powerful God. He argues in 160, however many pages it is, that God is not all-powerful. And why does he do that? Because he suffered the death of his son. And he had to rethink his relationship with God and his understanding with God. It was through suffering and death that he had to, I'll use a term from Reconstructionist Judaism, he had to reconstruct in his own mind a different understanding of God because of his experience of the death of his son, his young son. So, who said it, that God is all-powerful and all-knowing? Judaism does, but that's not all Judaism says about God. Judaism says that also God's not all-powerful. So it's not about, so Rabbi Toba Spitzer, it's a reaction to a metaphor, a set of metaphors that have come to dominate our thinking about God, the rabbinical God concept, some biblical God concepts that there's plenty after that. What is sad about this is that once upon a time, our ancestors employed a rich palette of metaphors to shape their experience of the divine. I love that phrase. I hope she uses it in her book. Our ancestors employed a rich palette of metaphors to shape their experience of the divine. Metaphors that spoke directly to their everyday experiences. My hope, Rabbi Spitzer says, and my hope too, is that we can recapture the aliveness, which once pervaded our holy text and reconstruct, there's that word, and reconstruct our metaphors so that they are once again engaging and meaningful. I want to stop there for a second because I think that's brilliant and beautiful. Any thoughts, any comments about what Rabbi Spitzer said in that paragraph? Carol, you raising your hand?
Yes.
Please.
It makes me think about the 99 names of God.
Yeah.
Does each one of those names represent a different metaphor and a different experience that our ancestors had? And we try to understand.
Thank you, Carol. Right. Yeah. So we have in our tradition, 99 names for God, 72, 70 faces of God. And that usually is related to a name of God. And that a name of God, why is there this name next to this name? Well, the rabbis were always, they're always unpacking words. Well, if we already have this word, why do we have this word? This word must mean something else. And it must lead us to another concept of God, another way of understanding God, a way of seeing how God operates in our lives. So absolutely, when we talk about the 99 or the 70 or 72 faces of God, what we are talking about is dozens of different metaphors that are going to reflect a different aspect to God's being, or how God operates in the world, or our understanding of who and what God is. Absolutely. Thank you, Carol, for making that connection. Absolutely. Other thoughts about what Rabbi Spitzer mentioned? All right. I don't see any, so let's continue. Let's get into some of the metaphors. I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Okay, and just to reiterate, and this is such good stuff, I just want to be able to go through it. As she's saying, after having read that book that I quoted from, that she's the one who told me about, or when I told me about, she referenced it at the end of her article, the more we learn about the human brain, the more we understand that metaphor is fundamental to how human beings understand and talk about pretty much everything, especially the more abstract things in our lives. And if you think about it, what is more abstract than God? Right? We have never seen God's body. We have never heard God's voice. What in many ways is more abstract in the human brain, in the human idea, than the idea of God? So we need metaphors to be able to even talk about God and relate to God and think about who God is and what God wants of us. So under God and metaphor, when we talk about God today, we use metaphors that our ancestors began to develop thousands of years ago as they observed their world and formulated truths about it. So I like to think when we talk about God, we're not just talking about God. We're talking about the world. We're talking about our understanding of the world and how we relate to the world. Human experience of the sacred, that is a sense of connection to something beyond our immediate mundane lives, and a desire to interact with that something seems to be as old as humanity itself. And then she starts quoting an anthropologist, Barbara King, who's got a book called Evolving God, which is another great book. So let me just give you this, and then we'll get to the meat of the biblical metaphors and the rabbinic metaphors. Anthropologist Barbara J. King has suggested in her book, Evolving God, that religion evolved in our prehistory as an expression of something she calls, quote, belongingness. We're going to talk about Martin Buber and the I-thou relationship. In the beginning, there was the relationship. This is very Buberian. So we have evolved, and when I say prehistory, so our ancient ancestors, prehistory, religion evolved for belongingness, a useful shorthand for the undeniable reality that humans of all ages and all societies thrive in relation to others. Buber would have loved that quote. She goes on to say, I believe that the desire for emotional connection with the sacred is fundamental to our species. The religious imagination thrives on the human yearning to enter into emotional experience with some force vaster than ourselves. There's Mordecai Kaplan right there. The force, the power that makes for salvation. That's language Mordecai Kaplan used. God is a force, God is a process, God is a power. And we're going to look at what he had to say about it. So at some point, people started using metaphors to think about and interact with this vast force. May the force be with you. That is Luke Skywalker or whoever first said it in Star Wars. That is Mordecai Kaplan. That is Reconstructionist Judaism. That is a God concept that we're going to look at. And that is a way of understanding God differently that has been expressed by a number of people. When we talked about how do you envision God as a force, as an energy. Okay. So then I'm just going to go on very quickly. Talked about king, to say that God is a creator. That's a bit of a metaphor. God is a parent. We looked at that. Let me keep going down. This is what I love about what she says too, why we use metaphor. At the bottom of page 2, we cannot directly speak to those things that are most important. I disagree. I think we can speak to things that are most important. But anyway, let's go with this. We cannot directly speak to those things that are most important. And only through multiple metaphors can we begin to express the breadth and the depth of our experience. Now, I do believe that. And that's why my kids keep saying, why do you talk like that? Because those are the words I have to use to explain what I'm talking about. So it is through metaphors that we can begin to express the breadth and the depth of our experience. Okay, so now here, Rabbi Spitzer is going to go into what are some of the metaphors for God. Number 1, God is water or as water. And as she says, water is one of the most common metaphors for God in the Hebrew Bible. It's used to convey a range of experiences, being nourished. Water nourishes us, life-giving rain, being swept along by a powerful river, joining in the flow of justice. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, said the prophet Amos, said Martin Luther King Jr. on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. He quoted a Hebrew prophet and he quoted a metaphor for how justice and righteousness are meant to operate in our lives. Just as a body of water can buoy us, refresh us, and sustain us, it also can become fearsome in a storm and overwhelm us. This can be a powerful metaphor for our own experiences of the sacred. And again, the sacred being that vast other, that vastness beyond ourselves, that we want to relate to, that we find value in, that's meaningful and important to us. Some biblical water names for the divine include, I should have highlighted this, but I'm gonna highlight it right now. Look at this, through the miracle of technology. Can I highlight that? I don't see my highlighting tool. Oh, highlight text. There we go. Fountain of living waters, Makor Mayim Chaim. Makor Mayim Chaim is actually the better way to do the stressing. Makor Mayim Chaim. That God is the fountain of living waters. That's the prophet Jeremiah. That's the prophet Jeremiah, I believe it's chapter 2, verse 13. Yep, Jeremiah 2:13. For my people have done a twofold wrong, says the prophet Jeremiah. They have forsaken me, the fount of living waters, Makor Mayim Chayim, and hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns, which cannot even hold water. He continues the metaphor. The Jewish people have not, taken God as this metaphor of water, and they're using these other containers for other waters, broken containers. Again, more metaphor. That's how people speak. So water as a metaphor. I'm just curious, who uses water as a metaphor? Who likes water as a metaphor? I'm gonna stop the share for a second so I can see your responses. Does that resonate with folks? Does God as a water, as a fountain, as a spring, as an ocean, does that metaphor resonate with you? Okay, all right, you'll think about that. This is one of my favorite metaphors, actually. You ever heard that line? God is the ocean, we're the wave. That's the water metaphor. Okay, all right, let's keep looking at the metaphors. Give me a second, everybody. I'm trying to share my screen again. How are we doing, by the way? We got about 14 minutes. Everybody doing okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we may not get done through all this, but we'll give you a taste, and then, we can read it over for next class, and then, we can discuss it more in next class. Yeah, the parting of the Red Sea, right? Right. Judaism is very much attached to water. And by the way, the Jewish people in Israel living in a desert, water is life. Water is life, not just for people living in the desert, right? Our body is 60% water, whatever it is. No water, no life. So that's why I'm very partial to water as a metaphor for God. It is life. Water is life. I don't know why there's not a blessing for water. There should be. We can make one up. A common rabbinic name for God. So water we find in the Bible and in the Torah. A common rabbinic name for God is makom, right? That's back to that. Jacob earlier, when Jacob had a dream. How awesome is this place? How makom hazeh. God is in this place and I didn't know it. So the rabbis take that revelation, that experience of our ancestor Jacob with God, and they say, wait, Jacob used the word makom. That's a name for God. So here we have the name makom, according to Rabbi Spitzer, conveys a sense of being able to experience the godly in any place. It also connotes forgiveness and compassion, a sense of nearness to the divine. Makom invites us to associate godliness with all those places where we've experienced a hint of something beyond ourselves. Again, this idea of the sacred is something special beyond ourselves. It invites us to find the divine right here, wherever we happen to be in this place. The great Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, the Hasidic Rebbe in Eastern Europe, somebody said, where is the dwelling place of God? Rabbi Nachman asked that question of his students, where is the dwelling place of God? They laughed at him. Rabbi, you know better than anybody. Isaiah says the whole earth is filled with God's glory. The whole earth is God's place, is the dwelling place of God, his students said. Rabbi Nachman said, no, God is wherever we would let God in. We have to let God in for us to experience God in this place. Beautiful teaching. So we can find God. Can we find God in any place we happen to be? Tina, you were mentioning about your brother-in-law, Keith. And I've mentioned before my Haftarah portion in becoming a bar mitzvah really wasn't a Haftarah portion. It was taken from the final section of the Jewish Bible, the writings from Ecclesiastes that is usually read during Sukkot. My bar mitzvah was nowhere near Sukkot. It was in June. I think my rabbi just loved the quote. But Ecclesiastes says, a good name is better than precious ointment. And it is better to go to a house of mourning. It's better to be in a Shiva house than in a house of feasting. Now, as a 13-year-old, I had no idea what that meant. Zero idea. But I know what it means now. When we confront some of the most sacred and powerful moments of our lives, including the death of loved ones, we might be open to God's presence in that very moment of loss, and being around other people and the love that they express for their loved one, to hear that love expressed, to feel it, to feel that embrace and that hug during a time of sadness. Those experiences perhaps have more to teach us than going to a party. And so Ecclesiastes, a house of mourning is better than a house of feasting. Can we find God's presence? Can we feel God's presence in all the moments of our lives? Can we make room, as Rabbi Nachman, why did I just blank on his name? As Rabbi, you know who I'm talking about, not Rabbi Nachman, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk. Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk. God is wherever we let God in. Rachamana, now we're going to get into some Aramaic, and again from the rabbis of the Talmud, like Harachaman, the merciful one, the compassionate one, based on Rechem, womb. A beautiful and powerful divine name that we encounter in Yom Kippur liturgy is Rachamana, compassionate one. Rachamana is that from which we seek forgiveness, acknowledging the ways we've gone astray while knowing that we are loved and accepted. Compassion. Even when we go astray, knowing that we are loved and accepted, when we refer to God as the compassionate one, that's an important quality, attribute of God, a way of perceiving God that's helpful to us when we're seeking forgiveness. Another one of my favorites, Ruach. And I love how Rabbi Spitzer says this is the very first metaphor used for God in the Bible, right at the beginning of Genesis, right? Chapter 1. In the Bible, a Ruach Elohim, a wind of God, hovered over the waters. A Ruach Elohim, a wind of God or a godly wind. The word Ruach means both wind and spirit, is also associated with breath. The first human becomes a living being with the beautiful metaphoric image of God blowing the breath of life directly into Adam. So God as Ruach, God is Ruach, Ruach Elohim, a godly wind. Ruach connotes a sense of God's presence within us as the life force that beats in our hearts and flows through our cells like oxygen. What a nice metaphor right there, that God flows through our cells like oxygen. That's a beautiful image, beautiful word picture, Neil Gilman would say. It is easily incorporated in traditional Hebrew blessings. So now she's suggesting if we have a hard time with Melech HaOlam, a ruler, if we don't like that metaphor of a ruler, a sovereign, a king, or a queen, to in our minds substitute the word Ruach for Melech and say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, in our minds, instead of melech haolam, ruach haolam, spirit, wind of the universe, life breath of the universe, flowing through our cells like oxygen, and then the blessing that follows after that. And then I love how she says this metaphor comes alive as we listen to the shofar. Maggie, the sound itself a manifestation of breath, a symbol of the godly potential that flows through, that is breathed through each one of us every moment that we are alive. So let me stop the share. And again, thoughts about some of these metaphors that Rabbi Spitzer has shared with us. Yeah, Philip?
So diverting us from Judaism to another religion, I was thinking of the Church of Latter-day Saints when they reached the Great Salt Lake, and Brigham Young was leading them from Illinois to find their new home. When he reached the shore, the phrase that is associated with him is he said, "This is the place."
This is the place. Hamakom. Hamakom hazeh. This is the place. Hamakom hazeh. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, these metaphors are incredibly powerful. And as Rabbi Spitzer was saying in the article, you know, we need to renew, we need to look at these metaphors with fresh eyes, and not just when we, in our prayers, when we come across it in the Bible, just sort of go past it, but to spend some time with the metaphor and unpack it. And what does it mean? What do we associate with the metaphor? How can that metaphor influence the way that we relate to God and the way that we relate to life? These are powerful, powerful, as Rabbi Gilman would have said, word pictures. These are powerful word pictures that can connect us in the deepest of ways to life and to the source of life. And by the way, source of life is a metaphor, and it's one of my favorites. I love that metaphor, source of life. Yeah. Yeah, Carol.
When I think of water, I have to think of Miriam.
Yeah.
And it seems like the water she was able to draw must have been from God or part of God. Out there in the middle of the desert where there was nothing, and she was able to draw water. And it was life-sustaining. So that's an image that I enjoy.
Yeah, and it's a beautiful image, and that image we've brought to the Seder table, right, Carol and everybody, that we now, in addition to our 4 cups and our cup for Elijah, by the way, a metaphor for redemption. That cup of Elijah is a metaphor of the Messianic age, the redemption, the perfection of our world, adding that cup of water for Miriam, the role that women played in the redemption of the Jewish people, because as I like to say, no women, no Moses, no redemption, no redemption from Egyptian slavery. It was the women who made that happen. And that symbol of water, as it was mentioned before, going through the Red Sea, bringing that image, bringing that metaphor to the table of Passover is the way we continue to draw on these metaphors, reconstruct the metaphors, and bring them to our experience of Judaism to enrich it and engage it. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Philip?
You just made me think when you were talking about Miriam and water. What about Moses striking the rock and water springing forth?
Moses striking the rock and water coming forth. Moses going down the river Nile and Pharaoh's daughter adopting him. And without that water of the Nile, again, no redemption. So no women, no redemption. No Nile, no redemption. No water, no redemption. No Red Sea, no water of the Red Sea, no redemption. Yes, water is so instrumental. It is, and that's why, I think, Rabbi Spitzer said water is a major metaphor in Judaism, major metaphor. And I wish we talked about it more, and I'm glad we're talking about it now. All right, well, so if you haven't read the whole essay by Rabbi Spitzer, please do. You've got that. You've got the PDF. Look at the first question. Again, if you want to spend some more time when you think about God, what do you think about? Maybe some of these metaphors have stimulated your creative juices, and you know, you're thinking of other metaphors now too. So take a look at both of those questions on that other handout. Take a look at the third handout, which is by Sarah Hurwitz in her book Here All Along. And she is not a rabbi, and she's not a Jewish theologian. She was a speechwriter in the Obama administration who clearly is attached to her Judaism. And I think she wrote that book maybe even while she was in the administration. She may have still been on the Obama payroll when she wrote that, or I should say our payroll. So the nine, she offers 9 Jewish God concepts, some of them similar, some very diverse. I think those 9 are a nice 9 to start with. We might add some others to it, but take a look at, it's just short, I think it's 5 or 6 pages. Take a look at those 9 God concepts that are part of Jewish tradition, Jewish theology. We're going to talk about those over, you know, the next and the third session together. We're going to take a look at some of these God concepts. We're going to talk about them. We're going to ask questions about them. And just to give you a little hint, I'm going to focus on one in particular, one of my favorites. And by the way, this is for folks who question, you know, that God exists at all. And this is one of my favorite theologies out of all the Jewish theologies. And I've given High Holiday sermons about it. I've talked about it. And that's called predicate theology by Rabbi Harold Schulweiss of blessed memory in Encino, California, Valley Beth Shalom. Another conservative rabbi, Mordecai Kaplan, was his teacher. He got predicate theology from Mordecai Kaplan, and he just took off with it and did a deep dive into it in a beautiful way. Now, Sarah Hurwitz is going to mention a few sentences about, you know, predicate theology, but I want to spend more time with you on it because it is, I think, one of the most powerful ways to think about God and think about Judaism. And so we're going to look at that. We're going to look at Abraham Joshua Heschel, Martin Buber, you know, all the folks that she lists there, we're going to take a look at. So, so please join us. It's next Wednesday, 7 o'clock to 8:30, and then it's the following Tuesday, that's Tuesday the 16th, from 7 to 8:30. The reason we're not doing 3 consecutive Wednesdays is because there's a committee meeting on Wednesday the 17th that we want to honor, and so we're moving it to Tuesday so we can have our 3rd meeting that Tuesday. Now, in addition to our upcoming spirituality series, A God You Can Believe In, Your Personal Approach to the Divine, I just want to mention that tomorrow at 1 o'clock, we have our monthly Lunch and Learn, and we're going to be looking at an article that is titled, Republican Jews Like Me Are Being Chased Out of Synagogue. I love that. I love that headline. I don't love that it's happening, but it's a provocative and true headline. Republican Jews like me are being chased out of synagogue. That's tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And we'll take a look at some of the ideas in that very short article. And we'll talk about other things as well. And then Sunday, we are going to journey through the Bible using a metaphor. We're going to journey through the Bible. We are in the book of 1 Kings chapter 2, and we're looking at the wise King Solomon and his Game of Thrones, and the stories and narratives about King Solomon in the book of 1 Kings chapter 2. So please join us tomorrow at 1 if you can. Please join us Sunday. That's Journey Through the Bible is 11 to 12:30. 11 to 12:30, and you'll find the email. The emails went out, I think, and you'll find them. Let's see. I think that is everything. Any last minute thoughts? I want to thank you. We went 4 minutes over. Any last minute thoughts for tonight or questions? All right. Well, let's unmute ourselves and wish each other a good night and a Shavua Tov.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Hope
you.
to see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Nice. It's nice to see everyone.
It's great to see you, Carol.